Now, with HTML5, it's the latest standard in the HTML language, and a lot of the concepts that we're going to touch upon are going to be concepts that have followed HTML since its early beginnings and still carry forward even to this day. So HTML5 may be the latest standard, but we're not going to focus just solely on features that were added with the HTML5 specification. So you don't have to worry. You're not going to lose out on any sort of older HTML language that you're going to need to know in order to be an effective web developer. So first things first, what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So hypertext actually stands for it signifies the HT part of the HTML, and then markup language, the ML portion. So along with CSS, which we'll touch upon in another course, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and JavaScript, which is the backbone of all web-based programming. HTML is the cornerstone technology used to create web pages. So you can think of a web page as a human body, and the human body gets its looks and feel, the color of its hair and the features of its body will come from CSS. So CSS can be thought of as almost like an artistic panel that you apply to your HTML web page. JavaScript is the functionality, the dynamic behavior of an HTML page. So when you hover over something and a pop-up box flies up, or you see squirrely animations on your HTML page when you click a button and you see something, something taking place like boxes moving around. That is all done with the JavaScript programming language. And then you have HTML. So HTML can be thought of as the actual skeleton of the web page. It is the main portion, the body. It holds everything together. So all three of the technologies are absolutely essential in order to be an effective web developer and understand how the actual World Wide Web works. What the initial features of HTML were, it was actually created by a guy named Tim Berners-Lee, who was a physicist at CERN in Switzerland, and he ended up, he was looking for a way to be able to share documents with other physicists at the CERN laboratory. So if you date all the way back to the 1980s, Tim Berners-Lee is actually the guy who is considered the father of the World Wide Web. Although what he was working on back then doesn't look anything remotely close to what we have now, he did build the cornerstone or the beginning foundation of what would later become the World Wide Web. So as we talked about before, HTML is considered the skeletal structure of an HTML web page, or any sort of web page for that matter. So it consists of tags. So each bone in your body that allows your body to function, to hold upright, like your ribs obviously protect the inner organs, your arms have certain bones in order to be able to flail about, and HTML can be thought of as the same thing. So if you think of it as like a bone structure, each bone is considered a tag, and everything in HTML is a tag. So there's different types of tags. In fact, we're going to see all kinds of different types of tags, and each tag does a specific thing that we'll look at later on. So everything in HTML are tags. Tags can also be known as elements. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as DOM elements, and DOM stands for Document Object Model, which is basically just the structure of your HTML page. So they'll say when you manipulate the DOM, you've changed the structure of the HTML on your page. As we'll see in later tutorials, like in our JavaScript course, you can see that JavaScript can allow you to actually mutate and change the way the HTML is structured, which allows your page to then change in its presentation. But HTML by itself doesn't do that. You write HTML in a particular page using a code editor or something like that, and then the browser just renders the HTML based on the way it's structured. So browsers expect tags to be in a certain order and follow a hierarchy. So as we're going to look at the different types of elements in HTML, but you're going to see that there are certain rules that have to be applied. So HTML is very forgiving. You can write very sloppy HTML, but there are certain procedures that should be followed. So what are these procedures and who sets them? Well, HTML standards are set by the community. for the most part. Now, when HTML was first becoming popular, web browsers like Netscape and Internet Explorer, which was owned by Microsoft, and different companies owned different browsers, but the standards were kind of rogue. It was the Wild West of the web, where nobody was really following any certain criteria, and the companies that created the browsers essentially made the rules. And then you had certain developers that worked for different companies that would end up enforcing their own way of doing things, and ultimately you had a lot of confusion and just dysfunction within the community. So the companies, like I said, which own the browsers, they don't always follow the same rules, and in many cases, the browser companies just set what the rules end up becoming. So it's really just a trial and error that gets us to where we are. But all that said, we now have an organization called the W3C, which oversees the HTML standard, and not just HTML5, but the HTML standard, overall. So the reason why is, like we talked about before, all the different companies were going rogue and setting their own standards, and we needed just a peaceful resolution to all of this. We needed an oversight committee that would end up being able to say, okay, HTML5 is a new specification, and this is how we're going to do things, this, and this. So if you want to do this, this is the rules you should follow. And if you don't follow those rules, then your browser is considered to be non-compliant. So you don't have to follow the rules, but if you don't, then you have an entire development community that is writing code in a way that may only work on your browser, or may not work at all on your browser because you're not following the rules. So for the most part, we just have a few major browsers out there. We have Firefox Mozilla, or Mozilla Firefox, however you want to say that. We have Google's Chrome browser. We have Internet Explorer, and then Microsoft's new browser, which they call the Edge browser. And then we also have the Apple iOS Safari web browser. Now, believe it or not, a lot of these web browsers actually share similar engines as far as how they actually work and interpret HTML. But we'll talk about that at some later time. So we're going to go ahead and summarize this first video as HTML5 is the newest specification of HTML. So HTML goes all the way back to the early 90s. HTML can be considered the skeletal structure of a web page. It's used in conjunction with JavaScript and CSS, which we'll touch upon in other courses offered by hipstercode.com. The set of rules that HTML follows is governed by an organization called the W3C. And HTML is made up of tags called elements or DOM elements. And I also forgot to mention that another term that you may hear them called as is nodes, which is somewhat of an unusual name, but they can also be called DOM nodes or HTML nodes.